Hey everyone, and welcome to another Kanoa Reviews. Today we talk about the recently released Star Wars Squadrons. This game was only revealed a couple of months ago by EA, and though many people were a bit hesitant on how the game would be, given the history with EA and the Battlefront games, others had hope too, after the hands-off approach they had with Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order of last year. I personally was very excited about this game for a couple of reasons, but at the same time, also a bit fearful. My favorite Star Wars game of all time might actually be Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 for the GameCube, and since that is all focused about flying and dogfights, I was hyped and ready for another game in that style. Where I got worried a bit was the main presentation was about 5 vs 5 multiplayer, and that the game would be in stores for a cheaper price than usual, meaning in my mind that it might be very light on content and not have any focus on single player missions. Now, having played the game and having completed the campaign and having fought a couple of skirmishes, I can say that both feelings were right on some part. There's a lot to love in this game, but also some fair share of critique. Let's take a deeper dive and see what we can discover with this title. I will mostly be talking about the campaign, since I think that is the bread and butter, since the multiplayer now is still a bit lacking in modes and maps. Besides, as said before, games like Rogue Squadron, but also X-Wing and TIE Fighter, had a big focus, if not only focus, on single player. But as I said, my favorite game was Rogue Squadron 2, and I hoped that this game would be in that spirit, but that hope might have actually caused some of the disappointment I felt with the game, which I will talk about later. Rather than being a spiritual successor to Rogue Squadron, Star Wars Squadrons is more spiritual successor to X-Wing and the TIE Fighter games that went for a more sim-flying approach. Rather than being very arcadey, like Rogue Squadron, X-Wing and TIE Fighter went for a real serious angle where you constantly had to shift power between shields and engines, and every button on the keyboard basically had a function. It was pretty hardcore for a sci-fi fantasy genre of a game, but that is what many people loved about it from what I understand. I have to admit that I've never played the X-Wing and TIE Fighter games, but from footage that I have looked up and stories heard by friends, I can definitely tell that Squadrons is more in line with that game than with others. And so even Star Wars Squadrons has a bit of a learning curve, despite it being very well playable with something like a controller. The game opens up with a very cool scenario, where you do a mission for the Empire. The campaign will be played from both perspectives, which is very cool, and in the beginning, you can also choose your own character and give him or her a different voice, name, etc. It's pretty cool seeing how both characters you have created are fighting for the opposite faction. The initial mission and tutorial has some very cool beginning sections where you fly along the fleet of both the Imperials and the Rebels, seeing all those corvettes, frigates, and of course Star Destroyers in all their glory. Unfortunately, this scale doesn't really get portrayed anywhere else in the campaign. There are some pretty epic missions here and there, yes, also involving other ships fighting at your size, including Star Destroyers or corvettes, but it never gets to the level of the Battle of Endor, like it does with Rogue Squadron, and I think that is a huge missed opportunity. The game looks really pretty and gorgeous. You see everything from the cockpit of a TIE Fighter or X-Wing, and those cockpits are beautifully detailed. The areas you fight around are usually asteroid fields, outposts, dockyards, and more. They also look very detailed, to the point where you can get up close and personal and fly through the trenches and little openings. But because the game is so beautiful and detailed, it's such a shame that it never dares to go all out and present battles on a huge scale like we know from the movies or other games in the past. It always stays pretty small scale, unfortunately. The multiplayer revolves around 5 vs 5, so in the campaign, you also always have 4 squad mates with you and maybe a handful of other ships or one big ship, and that's about it. The missions start up with some good build-up, where you first have to scan some ships, which are straight references to the TIE Fighter games, and after having scanned some harmless ones, you finally stumble on some rebel activity. It is here where you get to dogfight for the first time, and the dogfighting feels very cool and is a bit more skill-based than your average flying games out there. In order to get, for example, good turns, you need to change the throttle constantly and change your power to either your front or rear shields or divide them amongst both. You can also set more power to your engines, lasers, or shields to gain benefits there, and all those options and different styles are really cool and pretty in-depth. It's really awesome when you are heading towards a Star Destroyer and divert all power to your front shields, then when you come in range, change power to lasers to do some good damage, and then when you pull up and fly away, to distribute power to the rear shields to take the incoming hits as you fly off. The first mission has you already dogfighting with TIE fighters and X-Wings, have you protect a transport and attack an enemy larger ship. The story that then follows mainly focuses on a secret project that the rebels are working on and the revenge of the captain who was close to the Imperial traitor from the first mission. Once the prologue is over, you will do a whole bunch of missions for the rebels and also get to properly know the squad that you will be flying with. And here I have to give some credit again, in that the campaign has some pretty cool and likable characters. Not everyone is as memorable, but characters like Frisk the Trandoshan on the rebel side are really cool and interesting, and the same goes for Shen, a pilot for the Empire that has seen so much war and devastation that his whole armor and helmet are all grizzled, battered, and scarred. But the helmet stays on the whole time, as the armor is keeping his body and bones together. Since he can't do much else, he has dedicated his life to do the Empire's bidding and to oust revenge on the rebels that made him this way. A really, really awesome character. I've seen some videos pop up lately where people criticize the game for being very social justice warrior, but I have to disagree with that. One of your fellow Imperial pilots, Gray, mentions in one conversation that he has a husband, and that's about it. It honestly is no big deal at all, and in my opinion, the lesbian kiss in The Rise of Skywalker that was then afterward left out in the Chinese version was a much bigger problem, since Disney kinda signals that they don't care about those rights by doing that. Anyway, back to the actual game. Once you properly start to do missions, you can look around the hangar each time and inspect your ship or talk to some of your squad mates. And here's where I was starting to see some weird things. The game is also made with VR in mind, and to compensate for that, you are not able to walk around the hangar and instead can only teleport around. This feels very limiting and almost a bit cheap when you play it in a regular mode. What's more is that even though the characters you meet are pretty interesting, the conversations you have with them are often very dull and boring, since it's just them standing there statically while nothing happens. This is again with VR in mind, since it will be like you are standing in front of the character, but on a regular screen, it looks very outdated and dull. I honestly, by the end, sometimes went and grabbed my phone while listening to them speak, as visually there was nothing impressive going on the screen. There are some cool cameos you get to see throughout the campaign though, including Sloane, Wedge, Akbar, and also mentions of Iden Versio from of course Battlefront 2. So as said before, you then start to do various missions for the rebels, and you also get a chance to play with other ships including an A-Wing, Y-Wing, and the U-Wing. All of these look great, and they also feel very different whenever you pilot them. They have different enough abilities and stats to make them feel really unique. And as you do more missions in space, you get missions objectives, like TIE fighters incoming, and destroy them all. After which, more TIE fighters come, and you have to destroy them again. Then a bigger ship comes, and you have to destroy that one too, or defend a Corvette or something else by killing all the TIE fighters. After only a handful of missions, I started to get a bit worried again, because even though the flying was awesome and the graphics and sound were great, I was starting to get bored. And unfortunately, I have to admit that feeling never really stopped all throughout the campaign. There are still some very unique and awesome missions that stand out, of which I will talk about in a moment, but the campaign and its missions are in all honesty very repetitive, dull, and dare I say, a bit boring. The mission structure never really changes, even in the later levels. Later on, there's, for example, a mission where you need to scan core reactors so that they activate as mines for the enemy ships. After you have first scanned a whole bunch, something you've done in the first mission, X-Wings approach, which you have to take out, which you also do in the first mission. Then 3 Corvettes head in and you have to destroy them, either by firing on them, something you do in the early missions already, or using the mines. Once you have done that, you have to do all of that over again and scan another cluster of core reactors, and this time 4 Corvettes head in with fighters, and you have to destroy those as well. Then once you are done with that, a frigate jumps in, and you have to destroy that as well by, you guessed it, scanning a new cluster of mines, which luckily at that point you only have to do once. And another later mission, where you are flying for the rebels again, you are first defending our Corvette from incoming TIE fighters and bombers as it's setting up communications satellites. And then once the comsats are activated, can you guess what happens? More TIE fighters and TIE bombers come, which you have to destroy to avoid the comsats from being destroyed. Then later on, they send a scramble ship, their equivalent of a bigger ship this time, and you have to destroy that one too. It all honestly is the same thing over and over and over again, and it really made me want to take a break from playing after only doing 2 or 3 missions each time. But that actually made me really question why I liked Rogue Squadron so much. When I think about that game, you also kind of do a lot of the things you do here. You take out TIE fighters, TIE bombers, take on Star Destroyers, and fight turrets. What is the difference then why I love that game so much and was quite unimpressed with the missions here? I will go back and play Rogue Squadron 2 again for a review on this channel to really find this out, but for now what I think it is because of the variety in the levels and situations with Rogue Squadron, whereas this is a bit bare bones and sterile. You see, Rogue Squadron isn't really a space shooter. Yes, there are missions in space, but also a lot of missions that play on planets. There's of course the Battle of Hoth, where you need to help your fellow rebels in blowing up AT-PTs, AT-STs, and of course the AT-ATs. Or fighting through the buildings of Bespin, taking on the trench run of the Death Star, or that awesome final battle with a fight over Endor. Every time you play a new mission there, it feels completely new and you're always excited about what comes next. But Star Wars Squadrons is only battling in space. And those that like the X-Wing and TIE Fighter games probably also want that, so for those type of fans, this more repetitive, straight to the point and dry style might be more to their liking. But to me, it just felt too repetitive to where I could enjoy the game and campaign to its fullest. Now I will give them this. In many levels there are optional objectives as well, and completing them will sometimes alter the mission a bit by giving you extra reinforcements or preventing the enemy from calling in reinforcements of their own. Details like that are greatly appreciated. Also, I have to give praise to some of the optional objectives when you are playing as the Empire, since the game gives you the option to make some really evil choices. There are sometimes civilian transports that are trying to flee, and the game gives you the option to destroy all of them or only the necessary ones for the mission. A few of your squad mates will speak out, how they don't think it's right to kill those having nothing to do with the war. But you are of course playing for the dark side, and the fact that the game lets you act as an agent of the dark side and commit those crimes is pretty cool. Nowadays people can be a bit sensitive about that, and I have even heard some people whine about how they did not want to play this game because they did not want to play as space Nazis. An absolute ridiculous statement. Whatever happened to the games like KOTOR or Elder Scrolls, where you could be as good or as evil as you wanted, and people love that choice. Some apparently think that being evil in a video game will also mean that you are evil in real life, which is the furthest from the truth, since it's just a work of fiction, and in my opinion, those people should just stop whining about that. Anyway, overall the campaign is too repetitive for me. But let's talk a little bit about those highlights I mentioned earlier, because there are some missions that are very cool. The absolute standout for me is the mission for the rebels, where you need to escort a ship through a nebula storm as you shoot away debris and are chased down by a single Star Destroyer in the storm. Lightning is going off everywhere and the stakes feel very high, with the incoming Star Destroyer looming in the background and blasting you to pieces if you lag behind. The mission is once again one where you need to just kill TIE fighters, etc., but the dressing and look of the mission are so unique that it gets away with it. Another awesome mission is where you play as the Empire and attack a dockyard where the Starhawk ship is located. In order to damage it, you first need to take out all the shields and hangars, and it really feels like you are procedurally taking down a behemoth by striking at all its weak points. For some of the shield's locations, you really need to come up close while dodging turrets and close shaving it through trenches and small openings. It feels a bit like a reverse Death Star attack, where the TIE fighters assault a large installation held by the Rebellion. There are also some sections in the campaign where you have to do a proper trench run, but they are quite short and don't leave that much of an impression, unlike the trench run from Rogue Squadron 2. Lastly, I also want to mention that your AI teammates are actually very capable and useful. I have seen them kill enemies without me giving them specific orders, but if you do give them a specific order to attack a certain fighter, they will do so and more often than not, deal out some really great damage. So overall, there's a lot to love with the campaign. The graphics, sound, and just the feeling of the ships is great. Some of the characters are really memorable, and a few standout missions just beg to be played again just to experience them once more. But unfortunately, the overall vibe I got with the game is that it's quite repetitive and dull as you do the same thing over and over and over again. And maybe that's what some people like. It's a dogfighting game, so that's what you get. But as I said, I'm more in the camp of Rogue Squadron, and that game offered a lot more variety in presentation, ships to fly, and also objectives. Also, the presentation of the game, though very pretty, is also underwhelming due to the static nature of just standing still in screens, where you can only look around, and the static imagery of the characters talking to you without anything interesting happening. Now, the game is not that repetitive to where I think it's bad or would not recommend it. I still had loads of fun, and there are great moments where the inner nerd in me squealed. The earlier mentioned Nebula Storm mission has a great moment where you fly by a destroyed ship from the Clone Wars, and it resulted in the biggest smile on my face. And so it's not that I would not recommend the game, but it's just to where I think the game is okay. And I'm sure a lot of people hope for a game that was far better than just okay. As mentioned before, you could do some skirmishes in multiplayer or against AI, which I do appreciate that they added AI battles. But after playing the campaign, I noticed that I was done with those battles very quickly, because the scope is once again not that big, and I felt like I did those battles enough already in the campaign itself. In the end, Star Wars Squadrons gets a 7.8. Still a great score in my opinion, and worth recommending to fans of Star Wars, or at least of those fans of X-Wing and TIE Fighter. Again, that sterile and repetitive approach is, from what I understand, also a bit how those old games were, since they were a bit more of a simulator approach, and in that sense, this is a worthy successor. I also have not played this in VR. From what I understand, the VR experience when you are in the cockpit is amazing, meaning that you might add a full point just for the added experience to this score if you play this with a VR headset. I don't think this will be a game I will revisit a whole lot though, and playing this only made me more excited to go back and replay Rogue Squadron 2 for the upcoming review.